Hello everybody, welcome back. Part 2 of our consideration of child protection. In our last video we were looking at discourses in social work. We're zooming in on one particular discourse, for child protection discourse. I think this is a newer discourse. In Germany it's very new, something like the last 12-13 years. We're going to be investigating it in this presentation, the basic definitions, the basic contexts. I think the word child protection has different meanings in different places, and this is my first question for you to discuss with your partner. Discuss with your partner, how would you define child protection? How would you define it? Now, you may wish to consider two different meanings of the word. Child protection in Western European states, states like Germany, for example, but you might want to consider child protection in less affluent, less rich countries, such as the developing countries or the emerging economies. Okay, so think about it in each of those two contexts, come up with a definition fitting each. Pause here and natter with your partner. What did you come up with? Well, I can give you examples from the literature. Thinking of a country like Germany or Britain might want us to give a definition like the one that I'm about to click on. I've got my favorite social work dictionary in my hand here. This is the one I look at most. And the authors of that, Harris and White, have come up with the following. I'm breaking it down into little steps. The little dots are all mine. What is child protection? It's the aim, it's the activities, and it's the processes involved in safeguarding individual children. So stop here, please note, we're talking about safeguarding particular children. There's certain children that we're going to be protecting, not necessarily the whole population in one go, but rather particular individual children. So it's the aim, the activities and the processes involved in safeguarding individual children. Which children? Those children who are specifically identified as either suffering significant harm or likely to suffer significant harm. Once again, I have to pause here and explain some of those words. I'm guessing as German native speakers, you might intuitively understand the word harm. It's almost a German word. It's not quite, it was, but it isn't. Think of a dog in Germany, a poodle walking down the street. That dog won't bite you. That dog is harmless, right? And it's the same word in German, isn't it? More or less. Harmful would be the opposite, and the harm itself is the damage, okay? So our concept here is resting on this idea of damage. Significant harm is a specific term describing a certain amount of damage, and I'll say more about that in a minute. So we're talking about protecting individual children, specifically those identified as suffering this damage, this hurt, this harm, or those who are likely to, so will probably in the future suffer this hurt, this damage. And suffering that damage, that harm as a result of abuse or neglect. There you are. So that's my first definition for you guys to think about. Pause here, natter with your partner. This definition is from my dictionary. You know, I typed straight out reading from my dictionary. But where's this definition really from? Because White and Harris here, they're giving a definition which is kind of out there anyway, so to say. Where's this definition really from? Natter with your partner. Did you work out my riddle? If you think about it, this is actually a legalistic definition. This is a legalistic definition. It's using terms from UK, England and Wales, child protection law. So the idea of significant harm, it's a little bit like the idea of the welfare of the child and how we develop that idea in German discourses. Significant harm is when the welfare is suffering to a particular extent. Okay, so the welfare of a child is suffering to a particular extent, suggesting it's almost measurable. And I guess the point in legal terms is this significant harm is a kind of threshold for intervention. It's a threshold when we can get the family court to make protection orders and so on. So this is really a legalistic perspective. Good. Hold on to that, we're going to return to it in a minute actually, but I asked a question about international definitions. This is very British, it's very Western. A German definition may be very, very similar using this Kindeswohlgefährdung concept, but what about in other places, different countries, global south countries? And UNICEF can help us with a more international definition. I found this definition using the UN term website, which I can thoroughly recommend. It's a great source for international definitions used by UN partner agencies. Child protection is a term used to refer to preventing and responding to violence, exploitation, and abuse against children, including, and now we have a list, commercial sexual exploitation, trafficking, child labour, and harmful traditional practices. And they list two, such as female genital mutilation and such as child marriage. So you're noticing a very, very different definition here based on a much more international context. And again, originally by UNICEF, I discovered this on the UN term website. So I want you to have a look at these both together, look at them together with your partner, discuss the differences, what differences strike you looking at these two definitions side by side. Pause here and discuss. What did you come up with? There's so many things that we could mention. I can't mention all the points now. One point I would like to stress though, if you look at the Western example of child protection and you look at who is the person harming, it's not explicitly mentioned, but there's something quite interesting about Western child protection. The idea is that you're protecting the child against their family. Okay, so there's this assumption that a child is with a family or caregivers, and this child protection idea is basically supporting the child, protecting the child against their own caregivers. And again, that maybe is based on a kind of Western assumption that every child is with family or other legal caregivers, foster parents, or so on. In the international definition, we don't really have that. Some of the protection involved in child protection is protecting children who maybe don't have caregivers. If we look at the first two examples they give us, commercial sexual exploitation, trafficking, typically that will be happening, done by adults who are actually outside of the family circle of the child. Somehow the child has been separated from their original birth family and is now in the hands of these criminal people. So there's a much more general sense of protecting against all general adults. In the Western example, latently you understand that the adults we're protecting the children against are primarily the caregivers, the parents of the child. We notice also that the international definition is looking at international problems from particular regions of the world, for example, which may be less common in the UK or Germany. I'm careful with my formulation, less common. It's worth noting all of these things can happen, or there can be a danger of these things happening, regardless of the state we're living in, simply because of migration, families taking with them cultural traditions from distant places. So actually all of these points are utterly important, even in the Western context, but they may be highlighting points which are statistically less common in the case of Germany or the UK. And again, I want to talk more about this, I really could, but it would make this video too long. Comparing these two definitions is really fascinating and really, really interesting. Let's move on though, different categories of abuse. I think I've already mentioned a few of these, but I'll just ask the question again. We do have a kind of common or classic separation of different forms of abuse. It's a gruesome question, isn't it? Think about child abuse. What different types do we have? Pause here and discuss with your partner. Well, the first type, physical abuse, again, bringing us back to that battered child syndrome that I mentioned in my previous clip. Sexual abuse, obviously, and emotional abuse. Please note, emotional abuse is sometimes called psychological abuse. So there's other terms for some of these forms of abuse. Formally, we then categorize neglect as a fourth category of abuse. You might say it has differences to the other three. It tends to be much less intentional as the other three. The perpetrator may even be unaware of doing it, which is unlikely to be the case with the others. So there are obviously differences there, but formally speaking, we include them together. I think this categorization, which is fairly international, I think it goes back to the World Health Organization. So there really are, there's a classic way, a framework for this internationally. Individual countries may have particular forms of abuse which don't really fall into one of these four categories. So we may have individual categories of abuse. In Britain in the 80s and the 90s, we became aware of child abuse taking place in children's homes. And the term institutional child abuse was used to describe that. You may have abuse caused by, perpetrated by particular individuals in particular professions or jobs. And again, that may be a category in a particular country which is more sensitive to it. So this set of 4 is only a kind of like a framework. It's not meant to be a complete list. International discourses on protecting children, thinking about international documents, you know, treaties, conventions, laws. The most significant document relating to this discourse is probably let's see where this is going, can't you? Of course, we've talked about it before, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. We talked about that a few weeks ago, didn't we? When did we say this convention dated back to? When was it exactly? It was signed in the 2nd of September. The 2nd of September 1989. So, you know, this is celebrated its 30th anniversary already. On the other hand, we're still getting our head around the ideas. We're still using the ideas in that convention, you know, to make our national protection frameworks more child-centered, more focused. You know, this is a slow learning process. So it may sound old to you. It was signed before you were born, but it's still very much a current source of inspiration for social work professionals and for legislators putting together new laws. So this convention really reflected children's rights discourses in the 1980s. The discussions leading up to the convention, they were international, they were global, they impacted on national children's legislation. Can you think of a law in your own country dating from this period? This is a question I often ask in countries like Germany, Britain, or Norway. Any laws in your country from that time? It's very easy to answer. If you're German, we have our Kinder- und Jugendhilfegesetz, and the basics of that law were all put together in 1990. That's been law for 30 years now. So it really is concurrent with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. The answer for Brits is also interesting. The British social work law, child protection law, also rests on the Children Act 1989, so also from the same period. Do you think this law reflected the full ideas of the UN Convention and the childhood discourses of the time? You know, is it exactly the same as the convention? Natter with your partner. It's not. It could be, maybe it should be. Obviously, the legislator was a little bit nervous giving children the full set of rights that they enjoy in that convention. You can often find little details where the legislator is maybe just withholding a particular right that we could, in theory, have given children. For example, in British or German child protection laws, the child has a right to be heard in all matters around their care. We could also give children, say, claims. You know, a child could have a claim to family support service. But if you look at how it works in most Western states, actually it's the parents that initiate claims to concrete services. So often we kind of step back from giving the children the full rights that we could do. And you can find fascinating examples by looking at the documents together to say, look, our lawmaker has captured the spirit of that, but not quite gone as far as they could have done. So again, it's still very much an inspirational and aspirational document. For the Global North practitioner, you know, I'm speaking to you. You guys are going to be managing social work services in Germany. You know, I'm coming from my perspective as being British born. You know, for us, for the Global North practitioner, the Convention on the Rights of a Child, it suggests services modelled on an idea of a child as a person with a lot, with agency and self-determination. Agency is an interesting term from, I think, sociology originally. The word has many meanings, but here it means something like the child is an autonomous decision-making person. A person who can shape their world. Self-determination, of course, the same idea, being able to make decisions about their own lives. The right to be heard, the right to demand services, the right to extensive protection against disadvantage. You know, reading the convention from my privileged position in Germany, you know, I'm thinking about extensive protection for children. Access to a child protection system of the highest standard with extensive resources. You know, that's what we automatically think reading this inspirational Convention on the Rights of the Child. I'm going to come to a close here. I'm going to abruptly break this video. This video is going to continue on my part 3.